50 persons take part in our films about dress, and you'll notice they're all quite normal as to shape and size. In showing authentic period costumes on living models, I've never had the least difficulty in finding suitable figures. But fashion does undoubtedly make shapes, and faces too, appear to change. And artists help to create the illusion by more or less ignoring types they don't admire and idealizing others according to their own taste and the taste of the day. This dress has the smallest waist in the whole collection at the Museum of Costume for a person above 5 feet in height. No, it's not 17 inches. It's 21. And that's probably equivalent to about 19 inches today, because there's more worn under the dress than anyone would put on nowadays. The corset was more solid in 1883 when our bridal dress was made. The chemise of lawn, linen, or calico was bulkier. And though, then as now, other underclothing was cut to fit as closely as possible, it must have taken up more room than our modern silk or synthetic material, particularly the flannel petticoat, which was indispensable in the 80s. There are people today whose waists, when they breathe in very hard, are small enough for this dress, and don't think one didn't need to hold one's breath in the 80s. But at the present time, women have no particular desire to make themselves look that shape. Nor this, the lady with a bend in her back, who was known very early in the 20th century as the Gibson girl. Nor this, the gown and stomacher of 200 years ago, which turned the upper part of the body into a kind of cylinder by encasing it in an inflexible corset. A corset made of the stiffest buckram, heavily boned. At least once or twice in every generation, women achieve a new outline. It might be this, the wide panniers of about 1750 with their horizontal line. Or this, the long perpendicular look of the Napoleonic years. Or that, the expansive silhouette of an expansive age, 100 years ago. Or possibly we might be asked to admire a line with all its interest concentrated at the back, as in the 1870s. Or the curious hourglass shape of the late Victorians. It's miraculous what can be done with the human torso, at any rate the female human torso, when the creators of foundation garments get to work. But perhaps the face, the male human face, is almost as great a miracle. Women change their faces too, of course, but not even the most skillful makeup artist is quite as daring as an adventurous barber. Let's look at Mr. Benny Hill, Mr. Jeremy Hawke, and Mr. Ron Moody as they are at the time of shooting this film. Now, as their faces might have looked a century before. We've put them in Roman togas because until the present century it was the custom for sculptors to show heads of any period with classical draperies, and we thought, why not revive that little device? When women become assertively feminine, men respond by growing arrogantly masculine. All the early and mid-Victorians grew beards and whiskers to the same extent that the girls they admired went in for small waists and exuberant curves, most feminine of modes. Yet in the earlier age, when women had worn comparatively scanty clothes like these, men had been as barefaced as you please. To look like an ancient Roman was the fashion in the last days of the 18th century. In fact, through the whole of that century, men had shown their faces unadorned. But not their heads. The more smoothly the barber shaved the face, the more determinedly the perruquier loaded the head with false hair. When invention was exhausted as to what could be done with long curls, plain or powdered, then they were gathered up into all kinds of arrangements of knots and rolls and clubs and bags and cadoggans and queues and pigtails. Hairstyles gradually grew smaller and less obtrusive until, by the 1780s, all but a few old stagers had given up wigs and were wearing their own hair powdered in this manner. It's often said that the revolution in France and Pitt's tax on hair powder in England caused men at last to give up the practice of putting flour on their heads and wearing their own hair dressed in a fairly simple way. But history shows that no revolution and no tax can abolish a fashion till it's played out. After nearly 100 years, men were obviously ready for something new, and whiskers began creeping forth. In another few years, they became more luxuriant. The French Count d'Orsay, the last of the great dandies, was one of the men who set this fashion. Meanwhile, women were reviving tight lacing, voluminous petticoats, ribbons and ringlets. The more women cover their bodies, the more men cover their faces. So these feminine trappings are the answer to those faces. Or is it that these faces are the answer to all those trappings? However that may be, when women discarded a petticoat or two at the end of the 1870s, men, by a simultaneous impulse, began discarding beards and whiskers. Moustaches, large ones, became the rage. Throughout the remainder of the 19th century, every possible change was rung on them. It was so many years since male faces had been seen without some sort of decoration that there seemed something positively effeminate about being clean-shaven. Many actors wore moustaches even for roles in which they were absurdly out of place. It was quite common to see Congreve and Sheridan revived in make-ups like these. When women play costume parts on the stage, they've always been in the habit of falsifying their figures to suit the fashion of the day, whereas men falsify their faces. Or perhaps these are actually the false faces, because if you come to think of it, if Mr. Hill, Mr. Moody and Mr. Hawke were true to nature, they'd probably look like this. Now, a woman who'd left her shape entirely to nature, with luck, might look like this. But it's only occasionally in real life that shapes are left to nature, and only occasionally that nature produces a human goddess. Theoretically, these classical beauties are admired devotedly by each new generation, but in practice, a little distortion is almost always preferred. If it's not tight lacing, then it may be square shoulders. This was the look all women strove for throughout the Second World War. If it's not square shoulders, perhaps it's the sloping shoulders so beloved by the early Victorians, with the kind of curved chest that's been called a monobosom. Sometimes the bosom was placed extravagantly high, as in the high-waisted early 1800s. And sometimes it was made to look decidedly low, as in the blouse of 1902 and thereabouts. At another time, it was the correct thing to pretend that one had no bosom at all, while in the middle of the present century, there was inflation in more senses than one. This fashionable figure is not much nearer to nature than its opposite, the boyish look of the 1920s. That is to say, if this is anything to go by. Yet between the 1920s and the 1940s, there were the 1930s, when for nearly 10 years, the figure was on the verge of being quite natural. The innovation of cutting the whole dress on the cross meant that feminine clothes could follow the lines of the real human body beneath more closely than had been possible for hundreds of years. The muslin dresses of Napoleon's time, being cut on the straight, couldn't achieve anything like the same clinging effect. And in the 1930s, the back décolletage was much more pronounced than had ever been seen before in all the history of fashion. A back cut as low as this was thought amazingly daring in 1806. Here's one of the 1930s daytime styles. It's a period that's due for rediscovery. Every fashion, of course, comes to seem amusing and interesting when sufficient time has gone by. What will be revived first, the bias cut, the clinging lines, the natural figure free from all exaggeration? Perhaps the fancy gauntlets, or the short-looking high-heeled shoes. or the characteristic hat, deliberately a little insane. There's always a certain irresponsibility about hats, and in the 1930s it was more than usually evident. What whiskers and moustaches do for men, makeup does for women. If the figure in the 1930s was natural, the face decidedly wasn't. Not since the 18th century had there been so much visible artifice as there was throughout the 1930s. Elaborate courses of treatment from beauty specialists began to seem almost a necessity. Eyebrows were plucked and sometimes penciled on again at a quite different angle. Eyelids were heavily shaded. Rouge on lips and cheeks had either a bluish or an orange tinge. Foundation lotions and creams were used by more or less everyone, and hair dye was no longer a dark or light secret. Makeup had been permissible, just permissible, in the First World War. It was widely accepted in the 1920s and an absolute necessity from the 1930s onwards. How long will it remain so? Not forever. The nature of fashion is such that it must change. But we may be sure that even if cosmetics as we know them cease to be in vogue, other artifices will come to take their place. Artifice of some kind is always à la mode. Powder and patches, paint and pomatum. False color. False curls. False contours. Artificial posture. And yet, what is a poor human being to do, seeing that a certain amount of showing off is nature's own contrivance? For men as well as women, even if it's only showing what can be done with whiskers. The peacock, it must be admitted, is a male bird. Yes, the peacock is a male bird. Who'd have thought it?